Sweet Savage Love by Rosemary Rogers, narrated by Keith Cummings. Was that why you couldn't sleep? Because you feel frustrated and restless? They were both kneeling, staring into each other's faces. Her fingers plucked nervously at her skirt until he put his hand over hers, stilling its movement. I wish. It seems as though every time we meet, we are either quarreling or can't we talk? This isn't the time or the place for talking, and I'm in no mood to play the gentleman and flirt with you under the stars, Ginny Brandon, he said roughly. Before she could answer, he had pulled her to her feet, holding both her hands. If you know what is good for you, he continued, still with the same note of suppressed violence in his voice, you'll pick up your skirts and go back to bed to dream your safe little virgin dreams. Because if you stay out here, I'm going to take you under that wagon with me and make love to you. You know that, don't you? He was too close to her, she thought feverishly. There was no time for thinking, and how could she think clearly when he was already taking her with him? It was warm and dark under the wagon, like a cave, isolating them both. Her body felt stiff and unyielding as he lay down beside her, like a board, she thought, that would splinter and break if he touched her. And then his arms took her and held her close against him, and after a while, because he did nothing else, she could feel herself beginning to relax. He held her quietly, his breath warm against her cheek, and as some of the tenseness left her, she began to tremble slightly. Bemused as she was, from somewhere she found the strength to whisper, I don't even know what it is I'm supposed to do. What? Hush. There's nothing you're supposed to do. I'm going to kiss you, that's all. Turn your face to me, Jenny. Blindly, not daring to open her eyes yet, she moved her face up to his, and he kept kissing her for a long time until some of the warmth of his body and his mouth had penetrated to hers, and she began to kiss him back. Gently while they kissed. She felt him take the pins from her hair, letting the heavy mass of it fall over her back and shoulders. His lips moved slowly and lingeringly from her mouth to her earlobe, and she could feel him for a moment bury his face in her hair. She could feel the stirring in him and in her. She wanted to speak, to tell them that she was afraid, and then his mouth covered hers again, and it was too late. His hands moved over her breasts and down the length of her body, exploring its curves and hollows through the thin cotton gown. When his fingers began to unfasten the hooks and buttons that held it together, she shivered, but could no more move to resist him than he, at this moment, could have stopped himself. With her mouth still clinging to his, and her arms around his neck, Ginny forced herself by an effort of will to lie acquiescent under his hands. She had wanted this. With one part of her mind, she realized dimly that perhaps she had wanted to lie with him just this way from the very beginning, when he had first seized her and kissed her so brutally. But none of her imaginings had ever been like this reality, the thing that men and women do together, that she and her friends had discussed in whispers in the convent as something terrible and frightening, but inevitable, had surely nothing to do with what was happening now. Gentle, still kissing her, he was easing her arms from around his neck, and again Ginny shivered as she felt her gown, her last defense, slip from her body. She had not thought that he'd want her completely naked, and it was only by closing her eyes tightly and gritting her teeth together that she could control her own instinctive shyness and the protest that welled up in her throat. At least, thank God, he seemed to know exactly what to do, exactly how to still her unspoken fears. For all his previous roughness and harshness, he was now only gentle with her, his hands patient with her shrinking flesh, his own fully clad body half covering hers now, his leg thrown over her to keep her still. His hands resumed their exploring, his fingers brushing like fire against her skin. She felt his mouth on her breast, lips and tongue teasing her nipples until she groaned a muted, strangely incoherent sound. And at the same time, taking her by surprise, his hands moved lower. Don't, love. Don't cross your legs against me. Your body is so beautiful, you've no need to be ashamed of it. He kissed her hair and eyes and face, and the pulse that beat in the hollow of her throat, and then her breasts again, until she was flushed and shaking with a recurrence of the same wild and thoughtless emotion that had swept over her before when he had held her and kissed her that last time up in the hills. Suddenly his hands were between her thighs, stroking the soft inner skin very gently, moving upward. She gave an instinctive, incoherent cry as his fingers found her, and he muffled it against his mouth. Be still, love. I'll be gentle. Just be still now. He spoke to her as softly and coaxingly as if she were a mare to be tamed and gentled for her first mounting. And after a while she forgot who she was and who he was and gave in, letting his fingers have their way, her body wreathing and straining upward against his, aching for something she couldn't yet understand or recognize until she'd found it at last. Her arms going upward to hold him closer, closer, her body straining against his until she came floating, shuddering back to reality, her eyes flying open. She was aware, without actually seeing them, of the blueness of his eyes, the shape and texture of his lips against hers as he kissed her tenderly, caressingly, his arms now holding her cradled against him. Oh God, she started to whisper. I don't know. You don't know? Not yet, my sweet, he told her softly. There's more. You're going to undress me now. I can't. Yes, you can. There's nothing to be afraid of. You know that, don't you? And you've come too far to back off. But in the end, because her fingers were shaking and clumsy, he had to help her. Jeannie kept her eyes closed until he forced her to look at him. A man's body isn't half as mysterious as a woman's is, he teased her. You have the advantage, love, of being able to keep your feelings better hidden. Oh, she said softly, half afraid when he put her hand on him, and he laughed. Is that all you have to say? You were more vocal a short while ago. Oh, don't. You make me feel... I'm embarrassed, I suppose. Is that so strange? All right, honey. I won't rush you. Let's start from the top. Touch me. Or aren't you curious any longer? Shyly, hesitantly, she reached out with both hands and put him against his chest, under the shirt he still wore, running her fingers along muscles that ridged under them. Her exploration stopped abruptly. There is a scar right there. You've been wounded. Bullet wound. And if you keep on, you'll find more scars. Mostly knives or bullets. You see what a reckless life I lead? You make me feel reckless too. She whispered the words, and he turned over onto his side and began kissing her again, his fingers moving very lightly over the skin of her back and thighs. This time, when she had found her breath again, she became bolder. She found herself wanting to touch him, wanting to become as familiar with his hard man's body as he was with hers. Her hands moved impatiently, pulling the shirt away from him, finding more scars, muscles that moved under her fingers, and then finally, more slowly, over his flat, hard-muscled belly, feeling him stiffen and catch his breath. The knowledge that she, with her untaught hands, could excite him as much as he had excited her, made her brave. Her hands slipped lower, hesitated, and then touched, held him. Oh, Ginny, he half-groaned, and then added more lightly. There, that wasn't too bad, was it? No, don't take your hand away. Not yet. Not until I've taught you what to do with it, when you have it. His hand taught her the motion, and he began kissing her again, hard and almost brutally this time. She felt him nudge her over onto her back, and her hands dropped away from him as his tongue started to trace patterns over her flesh, making it tingle. This time, she let him part her thighs without a murmur, and his hands were gentle between them. But when his head moved lower, Ginny felt her body arc with a shock. Her fingers caught his hair. She could have almost screamed. "No, oh please, Steve, don't. I don't think..." "For God's sake, Ginny. You're as beautiful down there as..." Hell. He seemed to catch himself, and his body slid slowly and reluctantly upward over hers, his weight pinning her down helplessly. "I'm going too fast for you, I guess. But it's damn hard not to. It's damn hard to remember you're..." She felt the molding of his body against hers, the hardness and impatience of him, and she was suddenly as tired of the waiting as he was. "I don't want to be a virgin any longer. I want to know, Steve." "All right, honey, all right. Let's put an end to your damn virginity then." His knees were between her thighs, holding them apart. His hands held hers, and she felt his body rest against hers for a moment before it was lifted, poised, and then, as he began to penetrate her, his mouth stopped her moans. He was gentle at first, as he promised, and very slow, lulling her into an almost security until that final, terrible thrust like a knife inside her, making her body heave upward in agony, her screams lost and muffled against his encroaching lips. He stayed inside her without moving, embedded in her, his body a part of hers, and then, in another minute, he began to move again, inexorably and steadily, ignoring her struggles, which gave way gradually as the pain lessened and finally disappeared to a kind of stunned complacence. Why had he changed so fast, from gentleness to that final, fierce hurt? Ginny lay under him, panting, her eyes open and staring into his face until he released her wrist and told her to put her arms around him. You hurt me," she whispered accusingly, even while she was already obeying him, her arms clinging to him. "It'll never hurt again, love. It'll only get better." She felt his hands on her breasts. His movements quickened, and then suddenly her body was moving with his, matching his pace and his rhythms, and she was discovering that he was right. There was no more pain, only the urgent, driving motion of his body as he took her with him. Laying there, against him, with his arms still around her, holding her closely, she thought, nothing can ever be the same again. Nothing. And then, listening to the sound of his quickening breath, now I know what it is to have a man. This is what it's like. It felt strange to remember that only a few weeks ago he had been a cold, hard, and rather frightening stranger, a man she had disliked and mistrusted, and tonight he was her lover. Ginny found herself wondering about all the other women he must have had, might have made love to as tenderly as he had made love to her. Had it been this way with that woman, the one he called Frenchie? And then, while he still held her cradled in his arms, she felt him begin to move within her again, and she did not want to think of anything but the fact that he wanted her, and he had made it wonderful, not at all frightening, and he must love her. He must, or he would not hold her this way, kissing her softly, calling her love. Her hand slipped down his back and felt the tensing and untensing of his muscles, up again to touch the long hair at the back of his neck that curled around her fingers. Very gradually, Ginny felt the cadence of his breathing and his thrusting into her increase, and by instinct she matched his movements to his. She felt again the now familiar warmth and pulsing in her loins, and her own body's aching, twisting movements as he took her to forgetfulness and fulfillment and back. And afterwards she was so weak, her limbs so lifeless, that she had hardly the strength left to return his kisses or to protest when he took a clean neckerchief, wet it from his canteen, and sponged her hot, perspiring body very gently, the cold wetness making her gasp as he drew the damp cloth across her breasts, over her belly, and even between her thighs. He helped her dress, over her inarticulate murmurings that she did not want to move yet. She was too tired. "If you stayed here with me, I'd be tempted to make love to you all night," he said softly, half teasingly, and then more soberly, "Have you forgotten the Apaches out there? Better go to your wagon and try to get some sleep." He took her as far as her wagon, kissing her lightly, and she had to be content with that. That, and the fact that he stood there watching until she had crawled back inside and pulled the flap down behind her.